Transition, key moments, the journey through life. One common transition is the one we take when we move from the structured environment of school to the independence of higher education and then work. But this time in life is not just about leaving education. It's about personal development, self-discovery and empowerment. Maybe you can remember the people who helped you, the support network you grew, and the feelings you had when you realised you had to work things out on your own. Now take a look around you. Is your organisation set up to empower your early career's talent to thrive? Are you able to support their transition, attracting and developing and retaining the best talent? We've been hosting this podcast for almost 2 years now, and this is the first time we've devoted an entire episode to this topic. So I've got a load of questions and I'm delighted to be joined by Anna Champion to go through them. So welcome to In Good Company, Anna. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, it's a delight to have you here, and we're very excited to talk to you today about all the things we've just discussed in the introduction there. So before we get into that, though, I'd like to just give our audience the opportunity to get to know you a little bit better. So we usually ask our guests always the same question, which is to just tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Wonderful. I'll see if I can keep to the 60 seconds. So I'm an early careers specialist. I've worked all my career within that space. So everything from attraction, recruitment and assessment, and then to talent management and development. I've run graduate programs across the globe and in a number of different industries. So predominantly my experience has been in the legal, banking, and then a conglomerate experience. I'm a trained coach, and my particular focus is on improving that transition from university to working life.
Amazing. It was well within the 60 seconds, so well done. I'm very excited to as I say, to talk about everything that you just discussed and get your wealth of knowledge and experience into some of the questions that we've got for you. So let's start by talking about sort of the younger generation and moving into the career space. So, we often hear that as Gen Z get labelled anything from like snowflakes to entitled and driven, but also to driven by purpose and curious innovators. So there's a kind of a wide variety of descriptors for Gen Z. You've dedicated, as you mentioned, your career to supporting and engaging future leaders in the workplace. So I guess the broad question is, what's your experience of Gen Z in the workplace? How do they show up?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I started my career when the very exciting millennials were coming in as well. So we've been through a couple of cycles of these different generations coming into the workforce. And I think ultimately, the biggest thing that we need to remember is that they are all talent that's coming from a very structured, and you mentioned it in the introduction, a very structured environment where it was very clear on their path into a workplace where rules are a little bit different. So there have been all these different names, and I think some of them were also used for the millennials as well. So some of this is a replication, but actually when it comes down to it, I think it's the same as when, I'm a Generation X, and, when we transitioned from full-time education into the workplace, we had similar ideals and similar focuses. But I think the difference that we've got right now is that actually this is a generation that's been given an opportunity and encouraged to speak about their emotions and their feelings. They've been given a language in the way that we've parented them. And that means that when they're coming into the workplace, they're changing a little bit of the way in which things have already operated. So I think that's one of the biggest things. The other massive difference that we have is around social media and the impact that that's had on this generation coming through. You think about social media and the way it comes at you. It's individualized, it's personalized, it comes on demand when you want it. It's at your fingertips. It interrupts our daily life in that way as well. But it also is creating a atmosphere and expectations of what it would be like in the workplace. So you've got this generation that are seeing their peers being CEOs. They're hearing about what it's like to have this ideal work life. And that's clearly putting an impact on how they show up, because they're expecting and wanting things to happen quickly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that are going on in this space that may impact the way that they show up in the workplace.
And I guess a sort of a byproduct of that as well is, especially what you're saying about social media and kind of this idealized way that everything should be the same way. There's going to be changes that younger people are recognizing in more traditional workplaces that they're going to want to change as time goes on. So there's going to be a certain amount of skills that they're going to have to develop themselves in order to kind of start to make changes. And equally, the sort of an education piece for the older generation that need to kind of understand where that's coming from and kind of find the best way of working, isn't it? So looking at skills and things that can be developed both in both generations. What kind of leadership or behavioural skills do you think are kind of crucial for Gen Z to kind of adapt, and how do you most effectively build those skills as they transition from kind of the school life to work life?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the similar skills that come through, and I think the most important one for everybody is this unrelenting curiosity of wanting to look at things in a different way, learn about things. So I think, I mean, the biggest change will be if we look at the speed of which a skill becomes redundant. It's going to be around that learning agility and the ability to be very self-aware that you need to keep developing yourself, and not just assume that you are a full-blown person from day one and then there's nothing else to learn. So for me, when we were recruiting for early career talent, that would be one of the biggest focuses that I'd have, would actually be around the learning agility, because that means that you can build on that and build the skills for the future. Because they have that appetite already. We used to use it in our assessment. We gave them feedback actually as part of the assessment process. And in that experience, we then were able to ask a question about what they'd learned during the course of the feedback that we'd given them. Yeah. And that was a really great indicator of whether they actually took on feedback and were willing to learn. So I think that's going to be the biggest part. I mean, people talk about tech skills, but all of that can be developed if you've got that learning agility and that curiosity.
Well, and for the younger generation, because tech has surrounded them, it's almost in their DNA anyway, isn't it? Like I was thinking just before as you put it, the millennials have been in that weird kind of period of being both an analog world and the digital world all together, and of course Gen Z it's only known a digital world. I've got a 4-year-old and a 4-week-old. They're not going to not know tech necessarily. So I think that's a really interesting insight.
Just on that though, I think one thing that is forgotten and often is seen as a bad thing is that they don't necessarily have so technology and the real world are completely interchangeable. They constantly move. Yeah. Somebody came up with a term which I love, which is phygital, which is the physical and the digital combined. And I think that is definitely the case for early career talent, that they don't see the divide. So if you're going to suddenly say, we need to be more digital, we need to do this, that concept blows them away, because life is just constantly moving between physical and digital. Yeah. But there's some of the core basic skills like Excel and kind of some even writing emails can be more difficult than and not necessarily present when they're moving forward, because they've been given the skills to be able to work in a university or academic setting. They haven't necessarily been given everything that you need for business. So I do think that is still an area where there does still need to be some approach in terms of supporting that. How they learn it, I hate classroom training. That for things like Excel, it's dull, but there are so many resources out there for them to learn it, but you might need to be encouraging or facilitating that to happen.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we come from about the same place when it comes to learning in the classroom, because it's all about experiential learning for us, and I'm sure it sounds the same for you. Also, one slight mistake I made there was you mentioned the term phygital, which I really liked. And for some reason, my head went straight to fidget spinners. So that's why I wrote down first. And then when you explained it, it made, of course, a lot more sense to the physical and digital world. So
that'll be our next challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
The next generation challenge is the fidgeting.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, for sure. I'm a terrible fidget, but that's another conversation entirely. I wanted to also tap into your experience of working globally, because as far as I understand it, you spent a lot of your career in Asia Pacific. So let's maybe have a little chat about that. So given the sort of diverse and rapidly evolving job market there, what unique challenges and opportunities do you see for early career talent, and how can organizations tailor their learning interventions to support those specific needs? Or are they different? Do you see a lot of similarities?
Yeah. I think there are similarities. I mean, the conversations, I'm now back in the UK, and the conversations that we're having in the UK are similar to the conversations we're having in Asia. I think there is some challenge, though, around being able to work in a different environment and with different cultures. So there's a natural assumption that all of Asia, which is obviously where I was based, is very similar. But in actual fact, the cultures are very different, and you've got some incredible emerging markets there. I was in Vietnam for my last placement, and the speed of kind of development there is and the culture is very different to the more sophisticated markets of Singapore and Hong Kong. And so therefore the type of people that you need in those environments and the type of accessibility to that could be different as well. So I think adaptability is definitely key, and the ability to work together. I think one of the biggest challenges, and I'm a natural extrovert, but working in a global organization, even as a natural extrovert, is sometimes being seen. So I think that's something that can be quite difficult in the Asian marketplace for early career talent, is that if they're working in a global environment, is that they are able to show what they're doing and to be considered alongside and in the same breath as people who are maybe nearer to the head office, if the head office is not in Asia, and given the same opportunities based around that experience. One of the opportunities, and I think one of the things we're going to talk about anyway, is around this kind of virtual hybrid working. And one of the opportunities I do see in Asia, which I think is really interesting, is whereas in the UK and in the US, there is a reduction in the amount of in-person time in a workplace. Right. Actually, in Asia, very few workplaces will be majority virtual. So they might have a hybrid element, but that probably only means one day a week versus in some cases and in some organizations in the UK for graduates, I've heard once a month is the expectation. And I do believe that will have an impact on potentially the Asian graduates actually accelerating, because they're having that exposure to other people day to day and having those opportunities. So that might be an interesting dimension that might come through in the next couple of years as well.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And especially when you consider the sort of the post-COVID world. I know post-COVID was something that we it's almost a distant memory now, but it still, of course, there's elements of it still that exist, a bit of an afterlife from it, in terms of behaviors and what you mentioned there about the going back to face to face. I mean, I was just the other day I was talking to somebody about living in this area. So I live in the northwest of England, and of course, post-COVID or during COVID, when everybody was working from home, so many people moved up from the city to the countryside, and so because they never thought that they'd go back to the office again. And of course, like there's then an expectation that actually they would need to go back, but it's not 5 days a week now, which it used to be. So that's fascinating to hear that. And of course, a lot of Asia was locked down for so much longer than a lot of the Western world. So it's fascinating to know that there's actually been a bigger increase and a drive to go back into the kind of office working environment. Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. And as you mentioned, we've kind of sort of led neatly into that next question, really. So what do you think what do you, looking at those two comparisons then, what do you think are going to be the benefits and pitfalls of that hybrid working for I guess, looking at that global environment? What do you think are going to be the benefits?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really tricky situation. It's easy for the people that have got their experience and they're already connected to people and have their community of support. I think that the choice of wanting to be working from home changes and sorry, it doesn't impact the day-to-day work because you're already established in your area. However, for the earlier in career talent, it's a really tricky thing. A lot of what we learn is through osmosis of seeing behavior and being available. So if, for example, your manager is going to a meeting, it's much easier if you're sitting next to them for them to say, oh, I'm going to this meeting, why don't you come with me? Versus on the call, being present and being available. So I think that's very tricky. And belonging becomes hard as well if you're starting out and you have nobody around you. One of the things that I was very conscious of, and COVID, you're right, COVID is going to have an impact for quite a long time, and we will see it coming through in different ways. But certainly during COVID, when we first had the problem of lockdown, I very quickly made the decision with my organization that we weren't going to rely on our managers for the first interns because it was such a big ask on line managers. And I think this is the biggest thing. It's the line manager pressure as well of how do you manage people remotely? It's a lot harder to deal with those feedback conversations. It's a lot harder to be able to, if I want to speak to somebody, I have to set up a meeting. It's much more regulated than it was. And so therefore, those in the flow of work, feedback opportunities can be a lot harder because the diaries are a lot more compact, everything's happening. So I think that's where it's quite difficult for early career talent to navigate, and also for the managers to do so.
Do you think that opinion applies to? Do you think that's reflected in Gen Zers as well? Do you think they feel the same way as what we as of older generations? Because we've known both workplace environments, haven't we? And I've kind of thought to be onboarded into a company where it's only ever virtual, you don't have the water cooler moments that we would often have, which was what we've kind of grown used to. But if you've never known that anyway, do you think that they feel the same way? Do you think that they?
Yeah, I think that is a really relevant point. But on the other side, I think a lot of what happens with early and career talent is that sometimes they don't know what they don't know. And therefore, there needs to be some support and some intention around how you manage and develop and give them the skills that they need to develop. Yeah. And that's where it becomes a bit trickier because actually, you're absolutely right. The generation coming into the workplace are quite happy to work remotely. However, if we look at statistics like mental health, burnout, those sorts of conversations are much, much more frequent. One element is because they have a vocabulary to be able to talk about that and the confidence to be able to talk about it. But the other element is, again, back down to this belonging. They will often see a problem. It might be a small problem, but then they don't know who to talk to. And that then can escalate very quickly into a bigger issue. So getting access time with their manager can be really difficult. So suddenly they're twiddling their thumbs because they don't know what to do with the workload. And because they're not necessarily sitting near people, they haven't built those relationships. It's much harder to build those relationships. So I do agree that perhaps they don't know that. But on the other hand, I think there is an element that we need to be much more intentional in providing those with opportunities to learn. And therefore, that is a big stress sometimes on a manager who's already very busy. And so that's how we need to be signposting some of this to help them develop quicker.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I'm totally with you because I'm one of those people that gets that value of I really like what you said before, learning through osmosis. I'm that person as well. I love sometimes just observing and just witnessing firsthand an environment, a culture that you might be in. And yeah, I a bit like you, really, I suppose, but a bit of an extrovert, and that I actually gain a lot of energy from being around people. I find it quite difficult. I found the COVID times very difficult to be at home and work remotely and not be surrounded by other people. I mean, we did things like created like a virtual canteen where it was a Teams room, a Teams meeting that was always on. So you could just kind of drop in and have a conversation with somebody and have those moments that you would normally have in the office, but not necessarily have it when you were online, because you just felt like you were bothering somebody if you just wanted to catch up in an hour, you know? It was, it feels so alien now, but it's,
And I think, I mean, ultimately we want to be around people, you know, like
social
we want
animals,
to have some of that. And so I think it's not that I don't believe that there is some room for hybrid working, but I think in the early career space, there needs to be an intentional strategy to help and support that and the learning, because otherwise what you can find is that they become very lost in that and they're not building the relationship with the organization and therefore not connecting and believing and actually early career talent want to support the beliefs and the values of the organization. That's a very important factor to them. So if they don't have that element, then that means that they can disengage very, very quickly. And that can be very difficult. I'm coaching a number of graduates that are in their first few months at the moment. And pretty much all of them will be in the office at least 4 out of 5 days. And that's their choice. That's not the company saying that that's what they need to do. So they are choosing to be in the office. They're choosing to work hard. They are worried about being behind, and so they want to be accelerating and asking for more work, and they definitely felt like their life has been on hold at some point in their formative years, and so they definitely are wanting to be connected and to develop fast.
Yeah, and that's great. I think that because that's ultimately going to, and that confidence to be able to do that is going to be massive for their careers, isn't it? We talked earlier about mental health and well-being, and as you said, there's a language for it now, and especially as with the rise of social media, and of course that is something that's so important to kind of look after in the workplace. So what advice can you give to employers to help support well-being and mental health for, well, not just Gen Zers but everyone?
I think some of this is around being open to the conversations and being okay to speak about it. It is tricky. If we look at the statistics, it does look like the generation coming through, there's a mental health challenge and that they are seeing more difficulties. I hear a lot more conversations around what will burnout feel like, almost expecting that burnout's going to happen. And so I think my advice is really around ensuring that it's very clear that you do expect how performance, we all know peak performance happens when we're in a really great state, that we're in a place where we have looked after ourselves, not just in the workplace, but everything that goes around it. And I think there's some consideration for that is really, really important, is kind of putting that through, that we don't expect you to work every hour of the day, because we do want you to ensure that you're bringing your best self to the workplace. And by doing that, you need to take care of yourself. So I think there's something element there. I think giving them channels to be able to talk about it is really important. One of the reasons I believe quite wholly in coaching, and one of the reasons that when I was running my last program, I probably would spend about 20 hours of my month on one-to-one conversations with my graduates. And that conversation was not very rarely would be at the extreme of a mental health challenge, but we were dealing with challenges every single day that they were encountering. Perhaps they were getting a piece of bad feedback from their line manager. Many of these graduates had been the top of academically for all their life. So this could have been one of the first bits of bad feedback that they'd had. You know, you need to do something differently. And it's very easy, if that's not captured early for that to accelerate and spiral into something a lot bigger, which goes along the lines of, I've been given a bit of bad feedback. I'm definitely not very good at my job. I need to resign. I'm not going to be good at anything. And you can see very quickly that that can spiral. Whereas I think if we give them opportunities to talk about some of these things, both with their peers as well, so the community, knowing that they're not the only person going through something like that is important. But secondly, also giving them the tools to be able to talk through the setup to be able to talk about reframing that and finding a way forward that works for them. I think is really, really important. I also think that's important for the line managers as well, because sometimes they're dealing with things that they're not so sure about as well, because of this different generation coming through who are much more open about talking about things. But I think there is something in trying to support them more individually earlier on, through conversations and support, versus the kind of immediate, we have to put in mental health support and everybody must have counselling or anything like that. I think there's a space beforehand that can help that, and hopefully hit off a number of them before it becomes too big an issue.
Yeah, for sure. When you've been talking there, it just reminds me of our leadership model, where it all starts with noticing, and I think that's so key. Because it's noticing from both parties, right? And because that leadership can come from either side, where if you notice that something's not quite right, people aren't maybe showing up. Maybe that's like a meeting where people used to be showing their camera and not suddenly showing their camera. These are all signs that, that something's not quite right. And so, having those sort of noticing skills can really help move forward to addressing some of those issues. So, I really like what you were saying there, and that ultimately, and it builds psychological safety, right? Doesn't it? Which has a knock-on effect to then trusting where you work, and I guess that massively helps retention, like talent retention as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting situation, because a lot of graduates have been told that and now expect that to bring their whole self to work, when in reality, I don't think many organisations really meant bring your whole self to work. They meant bring your professional whole self to work. And so we've got that. And then secondly, when you're talking about psychological safety, we've also got an upbringing that is increasingly focused on safetyism. Somebody said to me quite recently, do you see anybody with broken bones very much in the childhood space any longer? We don't see that so much, because we protect our children. And so because we've been protecting them and not allowing them to take as big of risks as perhaps they had, they're also, the resilience sometimes isn't there because they haven't been exposed to that. I think that would change. I think you with younger children may start to allow that. Oh
yeah, let them play with matches and scissors and all sorts of things.
Perfect.
I don't, just to be clear. The 4-year-old uses scissors. Anyway, I digress. But we started to get into kind of some tips there, and again, we've been great at leading neatly into next questions, which has been brilliant. So around what would be if you could pinpoint like a number one top tip for maybe a leader of somebody that's now looking after or responsible for an early careers talent, what would your number one top tip be?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I've got loads of tips, but the one that I think stands out for me is around ensuring that you can visualize who has been a good manager or a bad manager to you, and what did they do that made that. So, for example, I have an example where I had a manager who was a really poor manager and was a bit of a bully. I actually learned loads from that experience about how I was going to manage the people working for me because of that. Equally, I've got good managers, excellent managers, that I take a little bit of them with me. And so I think that's probably the most important thing, is thinking about who has stood out for either the right reasons or the wrong reasons, and think about how that goes through into your management style.
Yeah, that's a great top tip, and just kind of, picking out the best bits and that, again, learning through either experience or osmosis, as you put it earlier. Okay, let's look at, so that was kind of more for the person in the leadership type position. So how about that young talent? Yeah, I mean, you work with, as you said, lots of early careers talent. What's your number one top tip that you would always give those people?
Yeah. Very simple, 3 words: own your story. I think for the early career talent, it's very easy to get swayed by other people and their
Yeah.
opinions and what they're doing. And it's very important that as an individual, you understand who you are, what you can bring, all your experiences that you've had to date make you who you are. It doesn't really matter about mistakes or anything. They equally make you who you are. And you are the only person that's really going to be pushing your career. And so it's your story to write. So that for me is always going to be the first 3 words that I would say to an early career talent.
So there's something about what you just said that's really resonated with me, because I think I've been that person throughout my life of kind of figuring out what feels right based on what other people are doing and what other people's, says are right and that kind of thing. So I even now, the owning your story bit, I can sometimes feel that I don't necessarily. So that's been really interesting to learn that, kind of reflect a bit on my kind of own life, I guess. What hasn't meant to turn into a bit of a therapy session, but yeah, no, I think that's really, and again, yet another perfect segue into my final question for you, which is to kind of to look at yourself and your own career, I guess, because this is our favorite question to finish our episodes with. And I wonder if the answer will be the same as what you've just given, which is that if you were starting your career again, knowing what you know now, what would be the advice you'd give to yourself?
It's related, so it would be about enjoying the ride, actually. And I think when I was younger, I was really keen to get to the destination, when actually in reality it shouldn't be about the goal. It should be the experiences that you take along the way. I am very much into journeys, and I think that's the important thing: is sitting there, taking time to see where you are, see how far you've come, but also just living in that moment. So enjoying it, basically. I think that was something that I wish I'd known early on, rather than completely chasing for the importance of the destination in my early years of graduating.
Hey, it's so true as well, because there's been plenty of quotes on various inspirational images of life is a journey, and it so is. And if you just focus on getting to the other end, well, yeah, you've got to enjoy it whilst you're living it. Yeah, all 3 of those great pieces of advice, and so thank you so much for sharing. But that's it. Yeah, we've reached the end of the episode. So thank you ever so much for sharing your insights and giving us your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful chatting to you, and I feel like I've learned loads, and I feel like I need to go and reflect on some of the things that we've talked about. But no, they have been great. I've had some great takeaways there. So thank you ever so much.
Pleasure.
Lastly, where can people find you if they want to find out more about you? Where's the best place to go?
Yeah, so I'm currently starting up my own business. So it's the Talent Lighthouse is my business. So find me on LinkedIn, easy to remember, Anna Champion, and then the LinkedIn. Then my website is thetalentlighthouse.com.
Perfect. Well, we'll make sure that all of the links that you need to help you get to the next place after finishing this episode are all in the description. So that just leaves me to thank Anna again for joining me today. Thank you, Anna.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And as I say, go back and look at our existing episodes. And if you want to find out more about Impact or Anna, you'll find all of the links that you need in the description. And that just remains me to say, until the next time, take care.